Okay, there is another horror movie released this year that is really low in the percentage of Rotten Tomatoes. It's like down in the 15%, maybe even 10% by now. Getting a lot of crap. And honestly, another movie I did not mind at all. So judging from the trailers I saw of The Lazarus Effect, I was expecting the movie to either be bad or be just a so generic horror film that would be more like a 2-star rating for me. But when I actually watched the film with my dad, I was surprised, and I believe he was surprised as well, and we ended up liking the film. Now don't get me wrong, the film still is a generic horror movie, but ultimately it has a lot more smarts in it than you would think. The film stars Olivia Wilde, and the only other person in this film that I knew other than her was Evan Peters. Now most of you will probably know Evan Peters as one of the recurring actors in the American Horror Story franchise, but he is also Quicksilver in X-Men Days of Future Past, and he was one of the friends of Kick-Ass in the first Kick-Ass movie, but he was replaced by a different actor in the second one, probably because he was too busy doing American Horror Story series. Everyone else in this film, I really don't know. And while there's some people that definitely look familiar, and I probably have seen them in movies or series or TV movies, ultimately I do not remember them enough to make note of them. So The Lazarus Effect is about a group of 4 medical students that are trying to make a chemical that can help bring the dead back to life so that EMTs can have an easier job at resuscitating people. And also you have this one girl that is helping them do a documentary of their experimentations. So you got 5 people in this movie, and they're pretty much the only characters in this movie, except for a few roles that pop up for one scene. A lot of the characters are stereotypes and the kind of people you see in most horror films or even slasher films, because in the end of the movie it becomes more of a slasher-like film just with supernatural elements to it. Yeah, it becomes one of those obvious horror films where people start getting picked off one at a time. But anyway, during this one experiment, of course Olivia Wilde gets killed, they bring her back to life, but she might not be the only one in her body. So yeah, if you've seen the trailer, it makes it look like clearly she's possessed and now she's killing them all one at a time. And I find it a little hilarious that in the trailer they actually show the black guy die. It's like, we're not gonna fool around. Black guy's gonna die, and yeah, he dies first, just like a lot of other horror movies. But at least they didn't beat around the bush. Now there are some things that make it a little smarter than your average horror movie, and ultimately things that I liked about it. For one, I thought the cinematography was really good, and there's also some really amazing creepy imagery throughout the film. The movie will also cut sometimes to some documentary footage or handheld camera or security footage, but only when it feels like the right moment to do so. It does it at key moments where it feels right, and I like that. I think more horror movies could use that, because it takes the advantages it has of documentary films and found footage films, but also gives you more of an experience that most people want for just normal horror movies. Okay, if you watched my review for The Woman in Black 2, you'll know that I really hated how they used jump scares in that movie. It felt so random. There was no build up to any of them. It just felt like they were just putting jump scares in there just to be jump scares and just to mess with you. This movie, jump scares are not random at all, and they feel right. Unfortunately, they're done so right that they're predictable, and I didn't jump one single bit. Like, the build-up was obvious, and so it's the opposite of the problems I had with Woman in Black 2. Now, I get it, I see the build-up, but now there's no satisfaction because they become so predictable. So, ultimately, the Lazarus effect also is not that scary. But then again, it's hard for me to judge because I've become so numb by seeing so many horror movies that it takes so much just to creep me out, let alone scare me. At least film-wise. Now, one of the reasons I said that this film looks smarter than it should be and smarter than it's playing off to be is that there's this very clear theme throughout the movie, and there's this discussion and argument on whether, well, religion versus science in this film. Throughout the movie, there's all these discussions about life after death and if there's a heaven or a hell and what the people that have died experience this white light, you know, and whether it's heaven or just these chemicals in the brain that make you hallucinate. And throughout the film there's these arguments of, like I said, religion versus science, and then should we be messing with things that only God should do, or is this just science and God doesn't exist? And all these things come into play in the movie, and normally these kind of films, it would feel heavy-handed and it would drag the movie down, but for some reason, the Lazarus effect didn't feel that way to me. In fact, I liked how it was done in the movie. Does it feel a little heavy-handed sometimes? Yes, it does. But ultimately, those are questions that you'd have to deal with when you're thinking about creating something to bring people back from the dead, right? And this all also plays with the whole possession that happens with Olivia Wilde's character in this film. Yeah, when we get to the ending of this film where Olivia Wilde is going crazy and killing people, there are different ways you can view the whole ordeal. One, you can believe that she actually did go to hell, got possessed by a demon, and now is killing people. Or two, you can believe that the chemical that brought her back to life not only made her mind evolve in a way that is kind of like Lucy, and then she hallucinated all those things because of a recessive memory she had from a child, a traumatic experience. So you can think that either one, she's completely possessed and evil, or two, she just turned crazy because she just got brought back from the dead and the chemical is doing something to her mind. Now, some people might think of this as a cop-out and feel that a film needs to have one definite answer, especially when it comes to a fairly generic type horror movie. But in all honesty, I think it's harder to do it the way this film did, and that is give just enough evidence for both viewpoints without giving one too much evidence for either one. So ultimately, the viewer can decide which one to believe, and there's just enough evidence for both to be believable. Honestly, I think that's a lot harder to do, and that's why I have to give the Lazarus effect some credit. Overall, the acting was fine, except for a few moments. There's a few moments throughout with funny faces and just funny expressions that ultimately take away from the scares because they look so ridiculous. But overall, I think Olivia Wilde was creepy at the end of the movie, and she was good, and everyone else did a fine job as well. It's just there's a few moments here and there where I do consider there was bad acting. Just not enough to consider the whole thing full of bad actors. So yeah, I like the Lazarus Effect, and because of that, I'm giving it 3 stars. That's a pretty average rating, and it is a little bit above average film. I can understand why people dislike it, but I can also understand if you actually like the film. I did. My dad did. We both liked it. So, did you actually get to see the Lazarus Effect? What did you think about it? And if you haven't seen the Lazarus Effect, then what is your favorite horror story? As always, this was Bruce Gifford, and this was just my opinion.